All right, people, how you doing? Hoping everybody is well. Make sure we broadcasting here. Okay. Looks like both are a go. Okay. I'll let some people come in. Thanks, Clutch. What's good? Ad Media, what's up? AB. Soul Shader, how you doing? I'll let some people come in. How you doing, Kendra? Salute to you too. I may forget about this by the time Artisan comes in, but y'all can let him know. I actually bought, 2 different sword shelves, and both of them arrived broken. So I'm not going to be able to have my stuff set up until I get one that isn't. All right. People starting to pour in. What's up, Malika? Ron, how you doing? Arta Forte, what's going on? Unreasonable, what's up? DJ, Mr. Meach. Hope everybody is well. D. Scott. Antonio, what's happening? Jerome, what's going on? Young Jay. Aquateki, what's good? Bishop. Share Your Light. NJ Prophet. What's up, BGS? All right. Hoping everybody is good in here. Hoping everybody is feeling healthy. Appreciate that support, Malika. Hoping everybody is feeling or is able to shelter safely. Quentin, what's going on? HPM, Darker Visions, what's going on? 72 Pass. Dallas, Joe, what's going on? Okay. Y'all know, support the show if you can. For those who don't know, this is the Onyx Report, a program that critically analyzes the experiences, histories, and perceptions of Black males in American society across age, class, region, sex, and profession. I'm your host, Dr. THasan-Johnson, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Fresno State, Black Male Studies Scholar, and overall Black male advocate. In this program, we examine current events and major issues using an empirically driven Black Masculinist theoretical lens, thus including such concepts as the Black male dual economy, anti-Black misandry, phallicism, the subordinate male target hypothesis, and the Black gynarchy. Our goal is to remind people, including Black men themselves, of Black men's humanity. So join us every Wednesday at 5, either on YouTube or Interlight Radio. So appreciate y'all supporting it in. Appreciate the support, Bishop Red Pill. So I wanted to start, y'all know how I do. I like to look at a number of current events. And if you've been following me on social media, some of these will look familiar to you. M. Lavo, how you doing? All right. So let me get this up. First and foremost, all right, I want to shout out one Dr. Perry A. Hall, who, to my understanding, passed away a couple days ago, if I'm not mistaken, due to a stroke. As of this particular webpage, he was a professor at Africana Studies, trained in psychology, education, and social policy at Harvard. And shout out to him. He's at UNC, or was at UNC. But, I'd like to acknowledge the brother. I've met him once. Appreciate the support, Kendra. And it was quite a while ago, but I was saddened to hear about this. So we got we got soldiers going down, people. I don't think it was COVID related, but I'm not sure. But nevertheless, one way or the other, peace to him. So I just wanted to give a quick little shout out. And from here, just a few, mentions of some random pieces of information I thought might be of use. This is notification that came out about Niles Fitch, Atlanta native, who will be starring in Disney's first live action Black Prince. So this will be interesting on Disney Plus. And I only bring this up simply to point out, my son is 14. It's 2020. And I remember when The Princess and the Frog came out, how much celebration there was about the first Black princess. And it was funny to me how nobody cared at all whether or not there was any kind of acknowledgement of Black boys. And that used to frustrate me. And it's not like I'm really looking for Disney, to make me or my son feel any kind of way. But I just was more taken aback at how oblivious even those in the Black community were about boys, and to the extent that they weren't acknowledged. What's up, D Remedy? Thanks for the support. So that was just something that I thought was interesting. I have no idea what the quality of this is going to be. I don't watch This Is Us. I can't say anything about the brother one way or the other. There's some brothers speculating about, what's going to be going on in the performance, so on and so forth. I can't really speak to any of that. But for those of us who are amazed that it can be 2020 before anyone acknowledges Black boys in a particular way, I just thought it important to point out. Another piece of pop media trivia is this article we see on Atlanta Black Star referring to Amari Hardwick. DS1, appreciate that support on the Cash.app. So Amari Hardwick says, I was a strong Black father, and says that as he played Ghost, and said he was actually a better parent than Tasha and shouldn't have been killed off in season 6. I'm hoping that's a bit of a ruse, because they actually never showed him, anything going on. I don't know why. So anyway, this was an interesting article. And I think for me, it raised the issues of Black males and fatherhood, but especially around ideas around compassion, right? Mlavo, appreciate the support, right? Around compassion in regard to fatherhood. He wasn't, and he actually says this about his character. His character had bad sides to him. He wasn't the most compassionate, but that goes back to a definition of masculinity, right? That, predates, feminism's redefinition of both genders, where the idea of emotional presence became part of the definition of fatherhood. Prior to that, fatherhood was often defined based on, on being able to provide, right, in one capacity or another. Ghost, in some ways, is kind of reminiscent of that, but he does go a step further than that in really attempting to strategize, his children's well-being to some extent. And it's not, we can say this is a drug dealer, so on and so forth, and you'd be accurate in that. But at the same time, he actually maintained a very consistent desire throughout the entire series to see his children do well. And so it's interesting to note that you do have on one end this drug dealing character who's always in and out of the life, but on another end, he's actually strategizing for his kids to have what he never had. And his biggest, frustration is dealing with really a son who doesn't see the value in what he's giving. And if you haven't seen the end, we actually had a discussion here on my channel with BGS, with Valdez, and Artisan, I believe, and we all kind of talked about the whole issue of Ghost and what kind of went on. So check that out if you haven't seen it already. But it's nonetheless an interesting kind of analysis, and it's a good reflection on fatherhood and what fatherhood means, and why and what we value and what we don't. So the mother in the series actually motivates her son to sell drugs, but the father is considered a bad father, even though everything he strategizes is for his son to do well. Even after he dies, supposedly, his son is still forced by will, by the will he left to actually attend college and get his degree. So even in death, he still has to push his son, and he's doing so for an ungrateful son, so that his son could live a better life, an easier life than he did. I appreciate that, Unreasonable Man. Appreciate the support. So interesting kind of observation there. If you get a chance to check that out on Atlanta Black Star. All right, another article from Atlanta Black Star: Florida man released from prison after serving 16 years based on conviction achieved with no DNA evidence, shoddy witness testimony. It's an image of him here. Man's name is Leonard Cure, finally free after a Florida prosecutor recommended his release because the circumstances surrounding his conviction are suspicious. And we know this happens to, black men across the board. Black men are the leading group exonerated by DNA evidence. And we find more and more about this out, every week, really. And yet and still, appreciate the support, Keith Ford. I should say Keith. I'm going to stop saying y'all's government. I apologize. Anyway, if you haven't checked it out, give a look. I wasn't going to go in depth, but I just wanted to kind of alert you all to some things. I thought this deserved mention. It says it took 2 trials to convict Cure of robbing, I guess it's Dania Beach Walgreens in 2003. The first jury couldn't come to a consensus, but the second jury found him guilty of robbery with a firearm and aggravated assault with a firearm. Since Cure was a convicted felon, he was sentenced to life in prison for the first count and a decade for the second, to be served concurrently. So it's interesting to note how our guilt or our perceived guilt can add to real consequences, regardless of whether or not we're actually guilty. Let me get the last one of the last pieces of unserious news out the way. For those of you who remember Mary Kay Letourneau, she is known to have had sex with a number of her students. I believe this was junior high when it occurred. She did some jail time, then came out and married the young man she was having sex with. And now they are splitting, and she is looking for age-appropriate partners, apparently on dating sites. She's now single and is hoping to find love again. I post this article mainly to ask the question, right? What black male rapist can you see showing up on dating sites? And it amazes me what people are able to get away with. It really does. So if this is at all of interest to you, you can check it out. There's actually images here of her with the kids. So this is the young man she violated when he was a boy. They got together when she got out and had a couple of kids. There we go. Had a couple of kids. So this is an interesting thing. And I don't, MLR, appreciate the support. I don't know. I can't picture how many black males, convicted of sex crime like this could come out and have articles like this written. What's up, Damon? It's amazing to me how this can happen and be received, right, without any severe, protest or whatever. It just, I can't make this shit up. I really can't. Anyway, back to the serious news. This is a piece I think you should check out if you haven't heard already. Came out 2 days ago. This is Fox 2 Detroit, obviously, but you can catch it, I'm sure on a number of other sites. MLR, she's not considered a sexual predator. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Kendra said, I was just talking about social conditioning, not seeing females as sexual predators. Indeed. Sister Warrior says, I'm not amazed. It's par for the course. I agree. But this piece here, as you can tell from the title, 40 black men come forward to say U of M doctor sexually abused them. Now, these young men were primarily on scholarship at the University of Michigan. And, that actually played a role in how they were able or when they were able to come forward. And I said this when I posted the article online, especially, and I've seen this directly, especially for black males who are on scholarship. Many of them, athletes or academics, they carry the weight of uplifting their families, right? We still have a good portion of students that are first generation college. They're coming to college, being the first of their families to do so. And many of them are trying to find a way to uplift their families out of poverty. That is the Black experience. And when it comes to black males, the social pressure to be provider, to uplift families is huge, right? Even into boyhood, I've seen families sacrificing their boys' health by getting them into sports, hoping to have the next lottery pick to go to the NFL, the NBA, so on and so forth, or even to become doctors and lawyers. I've met countless young men. I've been teaching now. I've been teaching college at the college level for about 22 years now. And before that, I actually taught high school and junior high. But I've seen countless young men whose, sole purpose in coming to college was not to just get a good job somewhere. It was actually to find a way to make enough money to lift their families out of poverty. And that often meant that many of them went into fields they didn't even like. Right. That was one of the sacrifices that males, often make. They go into fields regardless of their interest based on, what will yield results. And many of them, for the most part, go into business. Appreciate that support, Goshen. Thank you for the $100 donation. So, in that, when you come into a university setting, especially on scholarship, and you're there really trying to uplift your family, there's not a lot of frame of reference for this kind of thing. And we, and many of these males were quite stressed to the limits in terms of what they experienced and what that meant. And you also have to remember, there hasn't been a large movement in the last 50 to 60 years really framing Black male vulnerability. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that tonight. So a lot of these experiences seem like, they're easy to understand, common sense kind of situations. But when you have the weight of your family on your shoulders, it's not quite that cut and dry. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what we're seeing happening. And this is not the first time we've seen these kind of incidents take place. So if you get a chance to look into this, please do so, because it is an important piece. Right. A couple of these are more coronavirus related. The last two I'm going to point out here, and then I'll pull up a couple more. Family ravaged by coronavirus, begged for tests, hospital care, but was repeatedly denied. The man who raised Keith Gambrell, who loved him like a son and married his mother, died in a blue recliner of novel coronavirus in his Michigan home. Gary Fowler, 56, went to the emergency rooms of 3 Metro Detroit hospitals in the weeks leading up to his death, begging for a coronavirus test, begging for help because he was having difficulty breathing, but was repeatedly turned away. It said that my dad passed at home. No one tried to help him. His son of 33 said he asked for help. They sent him away. They turned him away. In the hours before his death, breathing was so difficult, Fowler slept sitting up in a bedroom chair while his wife Cheryl dozed in the bed by his side. When she woke, her husband of 24 years was gone. This is a powerful piece if you get a chance to look at it, because in many ways it does frame what Black men are experiencing in regard to this virus. I think that's the son right there who lost his father. And it said by the time his son got across town to their house on the morning of April 7th, police and emergency medical workers had arrived. His dad was still in his recliner. A bluish tinge had settled on his lips and fingers, right? About 33% of the cases of COVID-19 in the entire state of Michigan are in African Americans, and about 40% of the deaths. So definitely something to be mindful of. We've been talking about in the last few shows the ways in which this virus impacts Black males adversely and the Black community in general. Yes, we do know that obesity and pre-existing conditions is a serious factor, but we also know that poverty, environmental racism, and a variety of other factors play into this as well. So the places we tend to live at, the food we tend to have available to us, the resources we have available to us, and that includes when we initially had to start quarantining. When I initially saw people heading to the grocery stores and raiding the shelves, it was people that had means, people that could afford to do it. And many of us couldn't, right? Many people couldn't just go up and drop $600, out the gate. Many had to wait for their checks. And then you had the whole quarantine shelter in place kick in. And so you had really just a cross section of very difficult situations for a lot of people. And that ended up being a severe problem. And then on top of that, you had many people who once they went on quarantine, found out that their jobs were no longer available. Some were not fired, which made it difficult for them to get, unemployment. Some were fired outright. Their positions were done away with. And throughout the course of this quarantine, are, trying to find ways to stay afloat. So there are a variety of issues with this, but we like to, at the Onyx Report, look at these from a black male perspective, and kind of go from there. Let me see here. All right. Another story. This is another one from Detroit. Man says dad was turned away by 3. I think this is the same one. Yeah, I think it's the same one. I must have pulled it up twice. Yeah, my bad. All right, hold on. I got a few more for you. So we're going to be looking at a couple of things here. Okay, let me open this up. There we go. Money Mike, appreciate that support. Right, the Black Tax, Sister Warrior, indeed. Golden Leopard, what's going on? Okay, so this one here, interesting article up on npr.org. That actually says that 73% of inmates at an Ohio prison tested positive, with Ohio reporting some 12,919 coronavirus cases as of Monday. The prison system now accounts for more than 20% of the state's cases. No other state has reported as many cases behind bars as Ohio, in large part because no other state has tested as many inmates. And I've been saying this for the last month, that, the prison population and the homeless are basically ticking time bombs in regard to this virus. And I do hope I'm wrong. But I've also been saying that by the time we actually start seeing reports that relate to either population, it's more than likely 10 times worse than it is, mainly because these are very underreported upon populations. So even getting indications like this, are very telling in terms of the impact they may have overall. So all we can do at this point is hope that that's not the case, but keep your eyes open, people, because this is definitely potentially a time bomb in and of itself. Oh, I'm sorry, I could have opened that up much sooner. All right. So something to keep your eye on. Wanted to shout out Guru of the group Gangstar. I'm a lifelong fan of his work. Passed away 10 years ago as of April 19th. So for those of you who don't know or may not have remembered, check out some of his music sometime in the next 24 hours and, just kind of bless the brother. I've been listening to him since 89 and I appreciated his work. He was giving young men like myself things to think about in relation to living life, women, dealing with, difficulty, all kinds of different stuff. Gangstar covered quite a bit, and that's not even to address the quality of the music itself. Roger Jackson, appreciate that support. So check it out. Just a shout out to Guru real quick. And I believe there was an album released not long ago. Some of you are probably a little more up to date on that than I am. I did hear elements of it, and I know his son was featured in some parts of it, but check it out if you get a chance. So again, shout out to Guru from a lifelong fan. All right, some of you may have seen this. nypost.com, New York City jail population dips to the lowest since 1946 after coronavirus releases, right? So we see Thursday, the mayor also announced over $250 million in cuts to the city's Department of Correction in the next few years. Cuts include over $6 million to train new DLC officers and to provide support services because of the reduced jail population. The city expects to save $244 million over the next few years from closing Rikers, slashing overtime for correction officers, and reducing postings. So again, something to keep your eye on as we watch how this virus impacts different segments of the population and sometimes in unexpected ways, but nonetheless, something to keep an eye on. Now, I'm probably going to do a review of this at some point But this is a series that's on HBO, and I'm sure those of you without HBO have other means of getting a hold of this. So if you can, this is something to check out. To my knowledge, it's a 5-part series on the missing and murdered Black children in Atlanta from the early 1980s. And I've only had a chance to watch the first episode, which is why I'm not going to go into depth here. But I just wanted to alert people to it. If you haven't seen it, it is something to check out. It's hard to watch it if you have a soul and not be moved by it, especially when you actually can see the faces, of the mostly children that were killed under questionable circumstances, right? See if we can enlarge this a bit, right? So these are the faces of some of the people, right, who were killed. And it's interesting to note, I've obviously been hearing about this since I was 9-10 years old, but not being an Atlanta resident, not knowing anybody at that time that was in the area, I just heard about it on the news. And just like the series is titled, it always referred to this as children. But when you actually begin to look at the faces, one of the things you find is that more than children, it's overwhelmingly boys. And it's something that I didn't know in that manner. My boy, Dr. William Smith, pointed out that when he was younger, he remembered people talking about the fact that it was boys, but he also added that many of these boys had the tips of their penises cut off. And now, so far, I hadn't come across that in my previous readings about it, I'm only, like I said, I'm early on into the documentary series, but then again, I haven't read about this since undergrad. So this is almost all new to me again, but it's incredible how many Black boys were dying. And the interesting thing I noticed about it is even up to the first 8 deaths were all boys. They still kept referring to it as children. And one of the things I noticed about it was just that, even within the Black community, we have a very difficult time conceptualizing male vulnerability, right? We have a difficult time making sense of it. We have a difficult time accepting it, because I can guarantee you, if this is all girls, it would have been labeled as such, right? It would have been listed as all girls. But for some reason, when it comes to boys, when it comes to men, we have a difficult time empathizing on those grounds. So like I said, it was about 8 boys that died before the first girl, and there was never a characterization of this being, at least in terms of how it was articulated, and not only in the series that I'm watching, but in the news that I'm pulling up. The emphasis on boys is just really something that's almost secondary. It's almost an afterthought. And it's just one of those things that hurts my heart, to see. Because again, we don't really know how to come to grips with that, right? Yeah, Kendra, they did have a strong suspect. I'm waiting to get to that. I've seen pictures of him, but I'm waiting to get the story on what happened. I might need to delve into a couple of texts on that as well. So we'll have to see, what exactly is going on with that. And some of you are probably more familiar with this, especially if you grew up in the area at that time. You might remember this on very different grounds. But I think in the Black community, especially, that just the lack of emphasis on boys in and of itself, to me, speaks to a difficulty with being able to acknowledge Black male vulnerability. And so, that's something that I think merits some reflection. All right. So a couple of the pieces of news I thought were important, I thought were worthy of checking out. I wanted to talk about abuse. And I think I really wanted to talk about it because during this quarantine, we're seeing articles about increased numbers of divorces, increased cases of domestic violence, or the popular term now is intimate partner violence, and even intimate partner homicide. And of course, the narrative is primarily taken up solely in the interest of women as the primary victims. But there's actually data to suggest that there are ways that we can reevaluate this on a different set of terms. Okay, so I'm going to take you just through a little bit of information that might be of use to put some more arrows in your quiver so you have some more data to bring to bear when involved in discussions about some of this stuff. Because I know how it is, especially you get to a family gathering and getting to discussions, as some of my subscribers have talked about, and not having information, it can end up becoming a very challenging thing to try and get your point across about the vulnerability of men and boys. So I like to be able to kind of provide some resources that hopefully will help with that. This was an article that went up the other way. Went up a few days ago. And I had a subscriber send it to me, and it blew me away to check out, right? This woman shoots man in the face on the west side after saying, "You're not going to leave me or I'll effing kill you." Basically what happened was that this was a woman who was cheating on her man. He came home, he caught her, and contrary to what you would think, or what we're trained to think about black men, he didn't go get a weapon, he didn't go attack them. He actually just left, or was trying to leave. And at that point, she pulled a gun and shot him in the jaw for leaving. Right? So this blew me away. And as I said at the top of the article, I've seen quite a few articles lately dealing with the uptick in cases of intimate partner violence during quarantine, but much of it ignores male victims. This is why I show so many examples of it, because many, including men themselves, haven't had 50 years of socialization to identify it, even when it's happening to them. And to make things worse, female aggressors are not sentenced to the same degree as the male aggressors. This woman only got about $15,000 bail, right? So y'all already know how difficult it must have been for her to get out, right? So she's out faster than he's definitely out of the hospital, right? And these are the kind of situations that black males find themselves in, black men in particular, that get very little fanfare. So even when there's an article, it's not like it's gone viral. It's just kind of there. But I post these kind of things regularly because I'm always amazed, even amongst academics, how many refuse to acknowledge female aggression, refuse to acknowledge male vulnerability. And so when you get to that, the what would you call that? The kind of cocktail that creates is one where black males just get forgotten about. And I get it, even amongst black men themselves, we don't like to talk about male vulnerability. Mainly, many of us are, kind of pressed to just kind of walk it off. We know we're not going to get much empathy. There's not really going to be a political lobby on behalf of black males, especially in terms of black male victimization in IPV kind of cases. So we have a tendency to kind of shame ourselves. We shame each other for bringing it up. We shame each other for talking about it. We kind of and if anything, one of the things you'll see usually in the comment sections when I post this stuff is black men critiquing the black male who was shot or killed, right? About what he should have done better. And it's an interesting kind of dynamic, but I get what it comes from. And if you're not familiar with where it comes from, check out Dr. Tommy Curry's book, The Man Not, and you'll understand it, right? We've been man nots in this country since the beginning. So by that, not allowed, not perceived, not treated, and definitely not having policy on our behalf as men, but as these beings that have male characteristics, right? And so in adapting to that kind of, experience, much of what we've had to do is learn how to endure without fanfare, without acknowledgement. And many of us have gotten so good at it, we don't even think about it. And this is why, a number of shows ago, I was actually asking black men, how many of you, since the quarantine, how many of you have had anybody call to check on you, right? How many of you have called to check on you that weren't asking you for anything, right? Like how many of you actually had people that just wanted to know if you were good? How many of you had checked on your brothers? Because I have black men that reach out to me all the time that are in complete isolation, and it didn't take the quarantine for that to start. They were in complete isolation anyway, unless it came down to people who needed them to do something. When they were a utility to someone else, that's the only time they had some degree of importance. So we're used to this kind of isolation. We're used to not having any value outside of utility. And in many ways, I said this before, we tend to just stay siloed even from one another, and so one of the things that I'm trying to push for is a new level of brotherhood, if nothing else, because as we've said repeatedly, nobody else is coming for us. Nobody's kicking down our doors to make sure you're good. So at the very least, can we do that for each other? Because nobody else is. And so when you look at cases like this that are indicative of the kinds of abuse that men grapple with, it's important that we find ways to support ourselves. And I hope we do. Appreciate the support, James. If you advocate for Black male victimization, there will be a vocal minority of Black men that would call the victims feminine, not real men. Exactly. When it doesn't take much to be victimized. I remember debating with a brother a couple of years ago online that kept pointing out that Black male victimization, especially in intimate partner settings, it wasn't real. It was just weak brothers that were taking too much. And I'm like, well, okay, so how strong do you have to be for her to attack you in your sleep, or pour some hot grease on you, or shoot you, as in the case of this guy? There are so many ways that a person can be attacked, can be victimized. It doesn't have anything to do with weakness. It just has to do with the fact that we're dealing with a population of women, especially when I talk about American women, Western women in general. We're talking about a population that has not been socialized to deal with male empathy, has not been trained to perceive male vulnerability, and if anything, in many instances, are taught that it really doesn't exist, and that there are really no consequences for one's actions. Right? So you can be shot, you can be killed, yet she implicitly knows that in many instances she can tell the police that you were aggressing her without evidence, and you can end up in jail. A good friend of mine told me a story the other day. I've known him for 25 years. And he told me a story about his first marriage in the 80s that I had never heard before. And, basically what he said took place was his wife attacked him with a broken bottle. And he walked out of the house to avoid it. And the police were called. And when the police drove up, she ran out of the house, jumped on his back, and stabbed him, or tried to stab him with the broken bottle, to the point where he was bleeding. The police pulled her off of him, but then began to arrest him. Because the presumption was that had she done that, or since she did that, he must have done something to cause it. Now, he managed to stay calm. He talked to the officers. Eventually, believe it or not, they actually did take her in for a couple of days. But where the story gets even more frustrating is many years later, his ex-wife told his daughter about the situation, but framed him as the aggressor. And so his daughter came to him to ask him about it, looking at him as an abuser. And the only thing that rescued his image in his own daughter's mind is that he was smart enough to keep all of the police records of what took place. He pulled the records out, put them on the table, and made his daughter sit there and read them, beginning to end, before they continued the conversation. That was the first time that she had actually been introduced to the fact that her mother was the aggressor, despite what her mother told her verbally with no evidence, versus what. So he didn't answer. He didn't tell the story his own way. He gave her the evidence and made her read it before he even began to talk about it. So what am I saying? I'm saying even a daughter who's known you her whole life, he raised his kids himself. He managed to get sole custody in the 1980s. How many brothers did that? But despite all of that, one conversation with her mother, and it was Case closed. He was an abuser until he made her read the police report. Had he not kept that, his relationship with his daughter would have been wholly different, right? Those are the kinds of situations Black men find themselves in because for the most part, we're perceived to be, the villain, the criminal, the monster from the get-go. And we can lose face with our own children behind evidence-free stories told by those who have a clear vested interest in being angry with us even after decades, and we often have no recourse. So, those are the kind of situations we deal with, unfortunately. And in the case of this coronavirus and this quarantine, I fear there will be much more of that. So all I can say is be very protective of your reputations, brothers, because there are definitely some things that are going to be levied against us. Now, I was going to play a video that some of you may have seen on my Facebook page of a couple that got into a violent altercation, but it's like 18 minutes long. And I'm obviously not going to play all of that. But one of the things that you notice about it, and if you go to my Facebook page, you can find it. I only posted it a couple days ago. It's been reposted a couple of different times. But it's a case where it's a couple arguing and their neighbors across the street are videotaping the whole thing, or recorded video. That I'm showing you my age, videotaping. They're recording it, and it's 18 minutes long, and they're fighting back and forth up and down the street. She actually took an impact drill and banged up his car. It's just ridiculous. She attacked him with an ice pick. He tried to choke her. But what it actually showed, among other things, is that, and much of the time she was the aggressor. I mean, there were a number of different situations where he tried to back away. He tried to tell her to stop. He tried to go. He tried to leave, and she wouldn't let him. She kept attacking him over and over. She would walk from across the street to attack him again. She squared up on him, got in his face. Let me see. I'll play a portion of it, but like I said, it's 18 minutes long. So I'll just get a little bit of it in here. Hold on. All right. Let's skip ahead a little bit. Can you guys hear it? Appreciate the support, Chief Rocker. So he's walking away at this point. He does this several times. That's her smashing up his car.
He's starting to record. He choked her.
Now, this is something I want you to. Now, I just want to say real quickly, because I'm only going to play like a minute more, right? But you need to watch the whole thing, and it stops before we actually see who gets arrested. The cops get there, but we don't get to see who gets arrested. So if anybody has any extra information after the recording stops, let me know. But what's interesting right here is that there are a number of people that stop to check on her. Now, at various points in this video, she like I said, she attacked him with a drill, with an ice pick. He's wrestling with her. But even what you saw a moment ago, where he wrestles her to the ground, he steps back and walks away, right? If that was a man-to-man confrontation, he more than likely would have started grounding and pounding. He might have started punching straight, somebody who's laying on the ground. He's actually not trying to hit her, but they're still arguing. They're going back and forth, and she's attacking him with weapons, but people are stopping to check on her, right?
She's saying, that's a power tool. Is he still tweeting? Is he recording? I don't know where he went.
Okay, so there's a lot more to it. They go across the street. It's a whole mess. But part of why I'm showing this is because when we look at some of the research data around what we're looking at here, we find out some startling information that, isn't necessarily common knowledge, despite that we all think we kind of have a handle on abuse. We have a handle on understanding it. Some interesting information that, and this is why I appreciate data, because sometimes it really helps us look at things a little differently. Now, this is from an older piece, accepted in 2006, published in 2011. Daniel Whitaker, Tadisi Halacius, Monica Swan, Linda Saltzman. Title is Differences in Frequency of Violence and Reported Injury Between Relationships with Reciprocal and Non-Reciprocal Intimate Partner Violence, right? And what I would call your attention to is at the bottom of the screen, the results section, right? Almost 24% of all relationships had some violence, and half, 49.7% of those were reciprocally violent. In non-reciprocally violent relationships, women were the perpetrators in more than 70% of the cases. Reciprocity was associated with more frequent violence among women. Regarding injury, men were more likely to inflict injury than were women. And reciprocal intimate partner violence was associated with greater injury than was non-reciprocal intimate partner violence, regardless of the gender of the perpetrator. Right? So what we're looking at is a case where we're starting to find that the narrative, especially propagated by the Duluth model, that abuse is always one way and it's a response to patriarchy, has some serious flaws in the base theory of it, right? Has some serious flaws. Let's look at, let me see. Okay, I left it in the other folder. Here we go. So we're going to go into the paper on this in a minute, but I want you to at least see the chart that my previous guest, Mais, from my last show last week for the Onyx Report, and I think Mike, excuse me for misremembering your last name, Mike. I didn't want to get it wrong, but I shouted both of them out when I posted this on Facebook. You can kind of see the information proposed here, and we're going to go into the paper that this information is based on. But I thought it best we start here because it's an interesting way to kind of look at something that we're told operates very differently. So the basis of this, is that 84% of all relationships are nonviolent. 84%. So this comes out of a meta study, right? This comes out of a paper written that is a study of a large number of studies. and brings them together, weights the evidence, and reframes it in a manner that allows us to see what's going on. So 84% of relationships are nonviolent. Only 16% are violent, right? And out of that 16%, the 58% of that 16%, so the red portion right in the middle, right, triangle, is bidirectional, right? That's what we saw in the video we were just watching. The violence is going both ways. And you're going to find in the Black community, the rates are either even or the rates are slightly higher for women, depending on which study you're looking at, right? So 58% of that 16% of violent relationships is bidirectional, violence going both ways. And some of the popular feminist interpretations is that women only respond with violence out of self-defense, right? But what we often find, especially if you watch the whole of that 18-minute video or you read more of the data, that's not the case. Women are often aggressors to greater degrees than men. As Dr. Carrie Keating actually says, she points out that women hit first, men do more damage, mainly because men are stronger. But women tend to initiate violence and often use weapons to greater degrees. Men generally use their own hands, but can do more damage because of the strength differentiation, right? Nevertheless, despite that almost 60% of violent relationships are bidirectional, the 42% left over are unidirectional, meaning that one person is committing the violence toward another. And what we find at the top part of the screen is that women tend to be the initiators of unidirectional violence at twice the rate of men, 28% versus 14, right? 28% versus 14. This is not the kind of information that I was ever given in the 1980s and 90s about abuse, about intimate partner violence, or then what we call domestic violence. This was none of the information I was given at the time. It was almost treated like a given that men were the initiators of violence in every situation across the board, and women were almost never violent, but if they were, it was out of self-defense. And that was the narrative. Clean, neat, direct. End of discussion, right? It's one of the things that we heard, but not something we're actually experiencing. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to pull up the paper that this is based on and actually read through a couple of portions of it. Uh-oh, hold on. There we go. Let me get out of that. Yes, all right. You know what? Let me try to pick it up a little bit. All right. Nah, that's not working. Forgive me, y'all. I'm just getting my stuff together here. Oh, there we go. All right. So paper was entitled Rates of Bidirectional versus Unidirectional Intimate Partner Violence Across Samples, Sexual Orientations, and Race Ethnicities. A comprehensive review by Jennifer Langen-Rickson-Rowling, Tiffany A. Misra, Candace Selwyn, Martin Rawling, the University of South Alabama. Right. Let's see. Let me scroll to a couple of areas real quick. Bear with me. Okay, so let's see. Those advocating that at least some intimate partner violence may be best understood from a gender symmetry position argue that IPV tends to flow in both directions, from males to females and females to males. Violence perpetrated by either partner has damaging effects for all involved, including children who witness violence perpetuated by either parent. Repeated reports of substantial rates of bidirectional violence suggest that risk factors for relationship dissatisfaction and common communication deficiencies between partners may need to be addressed as part of a national effort to prevent the occurrence of IPV. Right? So they're changing the paradigm. They're trying to say we got to move away from this model where damage only runs from males to females and understand it on a framework that's rooted in an analysis of the data that does not presuppose male aggression, does not presuppose female innocence, but actually looks at what people do as a framework, right? So coming down a little bit, let's see. All right, this procedure resulted in retaining 7 epidemiological and population-based studies with a total of 82,836 sampling units, 44,930 females, 38,906 males. Now, I point that out because I think it's important. Sometimes you'll see studies with 50 people, with 30 people, and it's not to say that those studies don't have value, but it is to say that it's important to actually look at the larger studies, if at all possible. This is a significant amount. Got 82,000 plus people being studied here to look at what's going on. Each obtained rate of weight was weighted by the sample size from which it was derived in order to determine the overall rate of IPV reported in these studies was 16.3%, 22.1% average unweighted by sample size. Among those reporting IPV and using weighted averages across these samples, nearly 58% of the violence reported was bidirectional. Correspondingly, 42.1% of the violence was reported as unidirectional. Within the 42.1%, 13.8% was coded as perpetually only from men to women, while 28.3% of the reported unidirectional violence was from women toward men. Right. Among the large population studies, the ratio of unidirectional female to male compared to unidirectional male to female IPV was 2.05 weighted. So, again, affirming the chart we looked at earlier, this is what the data from that chart is based on. This is the paper that chart. And you have to be careful of charts on YouTube or Facebook or Twitter. Sometimes they look great, but, sometimes people will just throw up a name and walk away, and, you're using it until somebody points out that somebody made it up and it wasn't based on anything. Let's see. What I want to do, I want to take you to the chart, which I think is the most impactful chart in this paper. All right. I'm not going to be on here much longer, but this is table 8. Let me see if I can enlarge it a little bit. I hope you guys can see it. This is table 8. Rates of bidirectional and unidirectional violence reported among white, black, and Hispanic ethnic groups from the same sample. Right. I colored in the black portion so you can see it. So here we have for white, black, and Hispanic, we have bidirectional, we have male to female, female to male, right? And what are the things we see? What can we pull out of this? Right? One of the things we see is the rates of male to female. They differ. Right? Now you can see it in other communities as well, right? White population, you can see it. And these are all different studies, 2005, 2008, 5, these 2006, 2004. These are different studies. And they even deal on some of the other charts with military. They deal with couples that are highly violent. You can see the rates actually change for couples that are already deemed as violent. Some real interesting information in here. But nonetheless, one of the things you can kind of see is that the rates of violence are, in many instances, significantly different, right? Going against popular narrative about men and male violence, male aggression, so on and so forth, right? So even if you come home, catch your wife or girlfriend having an affair in your bed and walk away, you might still be the victim, right, of intimate partner violence or attempted homicide, really, even if you haven't done anything, right? And there will still be many people that will assume that even though you got shot in the jaw for trying to leave, you must have done, and this is something I've actually heard people say, well, he must have done something. He must have tried to attack her, unwilling at all to at least grapple with the notion that he didn't do anything. And he didn't have to do anything, right? That's the thing. And Chief Rocka makes a very interesting point here that I want to put up, right? When he says knowing what's at stake, right? If we know that women aggress often, be it bidirectional or unidirectionally, when it comes to black men, right? The idea that we are already perceived as guilty before the situation even starts is already a problem. But knowing full well when the police get there, the likelihood that Black men will find themselves in jail, Black men will find themselves being pinned down, beat up, Black men will find themselves being tased, right? And just like the story with my friend, even if he hasn't done anything at all, right? And being in a situation like this, exacerbating the issue, raising the stakes of it, and then it possibly falsely accusing him, knowing full well how Black men are perceived. These are problems. These are problems. These are things that need to be called into question because Black men are already vulnerable. So we get back to the idea of Black male vulnerability. Part of that vulnerability is our susceptibility to others' assumptions of our guilt, right? Regardless of the data. So we can actually see data that tells us that women aggress more than men. And I can guarantee you right now, there's a brother going to jail on the false testimony of having committed a crime against a partner simply because he's male and it's more believable. Right? These are the kind of problems we grapple with. And so when I talk about male vulnerability, especially during the quarantine, obviously the number of these cases go up as people are forced to stay indoors with one another. Aggression, frustration, all of those things increase because you're dealing with people who are losing jobs, who may be losing family members, who may be grappling with different degrees of sickness from a variety of different conditions, including COVID-19. All of these things are taking place at the same time. There's a lot of tension, there's a lot of frustration, and there's a lot of fear. We know when times are economically unstable, particularly amongst the working class and below, people start to deal with the stress of wondering where the next meal is coming from, where the next rent payment is coming from. So yeah, tensions rise, tensions increase. But if we go into this with the religious belief that aggression and violence in relationships only happens from men to women, we will literally be putting blinders on to the reality of what people face, what they experience. And just like earlier in the paper, it points out, kids become witness to this, right? And if you're used to seeing your father, your uncle, your grandfather, whomever it is, being abused, what impact does that have on the next generation? Especially when nobody holds her accountable. And even if she gets arrested, she gets a $15,000 bond for shooting you in the face. How does that work? What does that produce over generations in a family? Well, for one thing, we know it produces an entitled perspective that some people can do whatever they want to you with no repercussions, right? No repercussions. They go into it knowing that there really won't be any repercussions. That's part of what you'll see in that 18-minute video, right? Where she's attacking her boyfriend with an ice pick. And it's interesting, if you listen to the women who are recording it, because you live in a small neighborhood, everybody knows everybody. One of the things they said was, yeah, she gets it from her grandmother. I bullshit you not. Listen to that 18-minute video. At one point, one of the women who's recording it says to another woman, yeah, she's crazy. She gets it from her grandmother. And I just was like, oh my God. We're talking about something that has been reinforced multi-generationally, but we're not allowed to talk about it unless it's solely something that men aggress toward women, right? So I wanted to give you guys a little information, hopefully some useful information to bring to bear when you're trying to prepare younger men for the realities of what comes with becoming a man. When it comes to debates, it might be a family debate. I've had subscribers tell me they'll be home for family events and they'll get into these arguments. And much of the time, because popular narrative is as it is, it becomes very difficult to actually argue with accuracy what's going on. So I'm trying to provide, the information that may be of use so we can actually get at the heart of what's really happening in relationships, but especially in a quarantine where the violence is, there's more reason for that to kind of increase in the midst of the frustration and stress that people live with, that, hopefully you can use this information to open some eyes, right? Hopefully you can open some eyes. You can get people thinking. You can change the discussion by actually showing what the data shows and just not what people's feelings or opinions must be. Because I can tell you, even after 20 years of higher education, this was still not something that I was given in class. Let me tell you, the way they would deal with abuse in classes that I took from undergrad through doctorate is they would bring someone into class who had experienced abuse. She would tell, and it would always be a she would tell her story about how she was abused, and then the shaming language would kick in, and the class would become this almost kind of church ceremony where people would express their feelings and experiences, whether it was their parents or their cousin or somebody they read about who was abused. And then they would all turn to the men and expect the men to begin to articulate how they will never stand for another man abusing a woman. And each man began to compete with one another to prove who could be the most, prove who could outdo each other in terms of showing who could be the most progressive. And progressive in that context meant that you could defer to women. You could prioritize women as the primary victims, the primary group that needed to be protected, and the women themselves were void of critique. Appreciate the support, Dwayne Brown. Dwayne, excuse me. So, if that's how it's been taught in higher education, right? We already know what's happening in television or movies. The only time you really see male victimization in an intimate partner setting is as a joke. That's it. You don't run across very many serious situations. Sometimes it's tolerated when it's boys, right? If you go watch Antoine Fisher, for example, Antoine Fisher is an excellent film that actually is one of the first that I'd ever seen that dealt with male sexual victimization by a family member, by a female family member at that, right? But it was only palpable. I mean, it was only, palatable, excuse me. It was only palatable because he was a boy. He was a boy. And because he was a little boy at that, people could begrudgingly accept that he was victimized and that the woman in the equation, the two women actually, there was a mother figure who adopted him, and then he had this adopted sister, both of whom were obviously significantly older than he, and the sister figure raped him. The mother figure just abused him in general. She beat him. She she talked poorly of him. That was one of the few films I ever saw that dealt with Black male sexual vulnerability. But it was acceptable as long as you were dealing with boys. But not that acceptable because you didn't see a slew of films coming out dealing with it, right? And if you actually start to talk about sexual vulnerability, sexual victimization, when you look, America is the only country that imprisons its citizens to the degree that it does. That being said, I have argued for years that it's actually Black men, statistically speaking, that are more vulnerable than any other population in regard to sexual assault and rape. Because when you account for prison, the numbers go through the roof in terms of men being violated far more than women. And statistically speaking, the majority of those men are going to be Black and male. But we don't have room. We don't have a cultural framework that allows for compassion for men who have experienced sexual victimization, be it at the hands of a man or a woman. And every time I raise that issue, the first thing I start to hear are either feminists that try to shift the discussion back to female victims, or I hear men come in and shame the men who have been victimized for not being man enough. Those are the two primary ways the subject is dealt with, and then it's done away with. And we go right back to status quo. Nothing else is dealt with. And there's so many different ways that men can be victimized. I'm not going to be on here long, so I'm going to give you one. And I think it's particularly important in the midst of a quarantine, right? Jobs are being lost. People are losing the means to support themselves and their family. So you got 3 kids, you're married, and you happen to work for a female manager that you find utterly disgusting. Not only in terms of her physical makeup, but even just her personality. You are not attracted to her in the slightest. You find her disgusting. You have had problems with her. You're trying to stay on the straight and narrow in terms of not getting fired arbitrarily. So you're doing your job to the best of your ability. You do. In the midst of a pandemic, she lets you know that you either provide her with sexual service or it's your job. And I'm speaking from both personal experience and from a lot of firsthand information from men who've dealt with it. Shout out to Icebreaker for the $100 support. Thank you. Appreciate that. JBA, appreciate that support. All right. Much appreciated for that, sir. I'm assuming that's a sir, but I appreciate that. So you're told provide sexual service, or one way or another, you're going to lose your job. And it's not difficult for them to come up with reasons to fire you. I mean, black folk more than anybody understand that, right? All it takes is, depending on the setting you're in. So if it's, some settings you could just be outright let go. Other settings, especially if you're in corporate settings, things of that nature, what they often start to do is they start to provide you with low numbers of low quality control reports, low reviews, low annual reviews. You start getting, like periodic reviews and each of your reviews is negative, right? And if you're savvy, you know that you put a letter in with those reviews that actually frames the situation from your vantage point. But nevertheless, the point ends up, you get a series of reviews before you get let go. There's a lot of ways to fire people, legal or illegal. My wife used to lose her job all the time, even though she was sick. She was sick. She had sickle cell. She was always sick. And technically it was illegal to fire somebody for health purposes, but they didn't. They would just create reviews that portrayed her to be a poor employee until they could justify getting rid of her, right? So that kind of thing can happen pretty easily, right? So the threat of losing your job versus providing someone sexual service can be very real. And when it comes to men, it's a threat that nobody really takes seriously. So now you either have to engage this, you either have to try to go to HR and hope you're believed, try to make enough noise about it to be heard, or start looking for another job. Much of the time, men either do it or they just start looking for another job. Like I said, we just walk it off. We don't, because we don't expect compassion and we often don't get it anyway. And when we try to invoke these situations into the discussion, they're usually dismissed because nobody wants to hear that. People don't want to frame that as some type of victimization, but at the end of the day, she has power in the dynamic. The difference is we have only learned to interpret power in a sexual harassment framework as physical power. We haven't learned to interpret it along any other lines. So if she has political power, if she has, the power of being in that space as a supervisor or whatever, that's still power, right? And that can affect your record for years, and yet nobody cares. So those are the kinds of situations that black men have to grapple with, often with no fanfare, right? Right. So Shada, it's already hard enough to get a job as a black male, let alone keep it. And now you're in a situation where you have to, anyway. So I just wanted to drop that. I hope that somebody may find it useful. I appreciate all the support for those of you that were able to. I hope you guys are being careful in the midst of all of this. I don't care if you think this is a hoax or not. Talk to some of the people in New York and New Jersey and look at how many people they're watching being pulled out of their apartments and homes in body bags. This is no joke, people. So I truly hope you guys are being careful. Keep your head on a swivel. You guys know how I like to close. I'm here to tell y'all we are not criminals by birth, perennial rapists, incapable intellects, man children, sperm donors, child support wellsprings, success objects, walking phalluses, ATM machines, lottery tickets, unpaid bodyguards, interchangeable stepfathers, child discipline proxies, unpaid repairmen, workhorses, or any other socially accepted dehumanizing stereotype. We're thinkers, inventors, innovators, leaders, fathers, and men. Embrace your humanity, know your worth, and extend your time, attention, and resources only to those who genuinely respect you. And remember, your worth is not defined by meeting other people's narcissistic, selfish, and unrealistic needs. You define your worth, people. All right. Peace.